Welcome everyone to Awesome Truth, a wrestling book club. I'm your host, Steve Semino, and with me as always is my co-host, Walt Schwenk. Hey, Walters.
Hello, Steven. How's it going?
Oh, the blowing raspberries is back, huh? the sleepy, grumpy, I don't even know how to describe that noise.
Exacerbated.
Exacerbated, there we go. That's a good word for it. Well, Walt, don't be exacerbated because we are back and it is going very well. We're here on Awesome Truth and we're talking book today. A big book. Maybe the book of the year, Walt? What do you think? Is this, I you know, Mox was last year, right? So this would be the book of 2022, perhaps?
I think
Mox came out like December, right?
Yeah, or maybe that was McIntyre. I can't remember.
Well, McIntyre was not the book of 2021, so.
No, but that was also a big one. At any case,
Mox came out in November 2021, so that was the book of 2021.
Yes, I can agree with that. And so far into 2022, I would agree that this is the topic of today is a top contender for book of the year. So just to clarify, my exacerbation is not based on the topic.
Of course.
It never is.
No.
It's usually just a general feeling of.
Long-time listeners will know that Walt is not making that noise because of any relation to the... Usually I think you make that noise more for like a fun book or doc too.
It's a bit of a zag to the normal zig, but...
Of course not. No, that has nothing to do with the quality of this book, which is a very, very high-quality book. Of course I'm talking about There's Just One Problem, ... True Tales from the Former One-Time 7th Most Powerful Person in WWE by Brian Gewirtz. Brian Gewirtz, if you follow wrestling, if you listen to podcasts, especially if you listen to Bruce Pritchard's podcast, he's become a guy that I don't think I was aware of, Walt, until 4 or 5 years ago. Like, I might have read the name on a dirt sheet or two, but I would say in the last couple of years, as we've gotten these more backstage stories, Brian Gewirtz's name always comes up, and here he is telling his own stories.
Yeah, I would say something to wrestle with. Bruce Pritchard, you hear that Brian's name a lot. Also, these new Peacock shows and previous network shows have been introducing him as a face of WWE creative, specifically for Ruthless Aggression. And so,
yes,
as a fan, growing up, you didn't quite know who this guy was and what that meant, but now I think now in 2022, most people know who he is and what he kind of contributed to the business.
And I wouldn't be surprised if that contributed to getting a chance to write this book. You know, there was always a hunger for backstage stories. What is this guy and that girl doing? How did this angle come to be? Tell me like the inside scoop on these failures and calamities and all that. But there's with the rise of the podcast era, like you said, the rise of the network, the rise of wrestling docs in general, there's been so much access to this information and such value in telling these stories. And Brian was there for so much of it, you know? Like, not only is his story unique in and of itself, how quickly he rose to power, how quickly he found a place in WWE despite really not being the kind of guy you'd expect to find power, to be honest. He's just been there. He was there for so much of the Attitude Era stuff, so much of Ruthless Aggression. Like, he saw a ton. Like, he didn't see as much as everybody, but he's from especially maybe his age too. Like, he's around our age. Like, he's a very great conduit into this whole era of wrestling.
So when I think about this book and I think about the information we were given and Brian's stance as a name in WWE, it gave me, and don't take this the wrong way, it gave me Justin Roberts vibes. Now, when I say that, I mean, wow.
That's dangerous. You're going down a dangerous path.
Hear me out. It's like, this is an extremely unique perspective. This guy was not a wrestler, but he had some great stories, some behind-the-scenes observations, and he made a lot of important decisions, or helped to shape and make a lot of important decisions. And so it was really refreshing to hear his take on a lot of those things, and just hear his stories with interacting with wrestlers in general, because he's not a wrestler, and he came in as a writer in a time when writing for wrestling was like unheard of. Where the book differs from Justin Roberts is it was far better, and he gave tremendous Brian gave tremendous insights into the creative process and not just like, oh, during the celebrity host era of Raw, I got pictures with people. It's like, no, Brian taught us how he like worked with them to produce a segment, not like, oh, I got like pictures with celebrities when they walked through the door. It's like cool. That's not a story, really.
Well, I see what you're saying similarity wise now that you spell it out too, because Brian has a lot. Brian was a self-admitted nerd. If you read the book, like he, loves a bunch of nerdy things. Like he does not fit into the locker room. As you said, not only is he one of the first writers to come on and sort of do his thing, but he's just not athletic. He has no experience in wrestling. Like he came directly from Hollywood. Like he was a college boy. Like he just does. He definitely did not fit in with this crowd. He obviously made his friends and found a place for himself, to say the least. But he's just definitely not the kind of guy you expect to stick. So I think there was a potential there for a Justin Roberts type story where he is a poopy baby and he says, "Oh, they were mean to me, JBL," and they were mean to him. Like if you read the book, there was a couple times where they were huge assholes to him, and it sounds like they were isolated-ish incidents, and once he earned people's trust and respect, they were not jerks to him anymore. But certainly, especially the first chapter in particular with Wrestler's Court, like that's a terrifying moment. Like I would pee my pants if I found myself in that scenario. That early in the job, not having allies, not really knowing the lay of the land, like there's room there to bury people, complain, whine, or it could have just been the end of his career. Maybe there is no book because he wraps up soon after that. But unlike Justin Roberts, to say the least, Brian found his place and his smarts and his intellect and his wit and his his aggressiveness and ability to argue and defend himself and his points. Like you can just see like how he sort of grows into the role and becomes a guy worthy of sticking and able to stick at a place like WWE, which I thought was maybe the best part of the book. Is the stories are fun. I love all the backstage insights and all that, but like the core of the book is I am a better person for having gone through this like shitstorm craziness for a decade plus. Like I came out on the other ends and now I have no fear anymore. Like now I'm stronger than ever.
Yeah, the Wrestler's Court intro is so profound and great in so many ways.
For anyone who hasn't read the book, basically he commits I won't spoil a ton, but he commits a quote-unquote crime in the wrestling world, and it gets drawn to literal Wrestler's Court, which is the thing that I think only is reserved for wrestlers. He says, I don't know if he's the first non-wrestler to be there, but certainly unprecedented in his experience, and went in and had all the wrestlers look at him and yell at him and were super, super mean to him for quite a long time.
That one story kind of set the stage for many more additional stories where it's just like this guy's introverted and he was never one of the boys, or not that he was never one of the boys, but like he was never a wrestler. And as a result, he's brought to this like ad hoc makeshift pseudo like hazing ritual, and every instinct he had was wrong. And it's like, and his crime too. And this is something that really resonated with me. His biggest crime was the fact that he worked with wrestlers closely and didn't work with wrestlers who didn't like him not closely.
Yeah, people who didn't share his sensibilities or he probably couldn't have written for, he didn't really write for them.
Right. And so like his crime was he's favoriting. It's like, well, wait a minute. Let's break this down. He worked with Edge, Christian, Kurt, and The Rock. Maybe these guys are like amazing visionaries, but ultimately they saw value in this guy. And a lot of wrestlers from 99 to 2002 probably did not see value in this. And you see that as a theme throughout the book is like people who just like, are like, what the hell why am I working with this writer? And so, as someone who's had to work with talent and produce talent before, like I 1,000,000% would have done the same thing. It's like, yeah, I'm going to work with the people who want to work with me. And I'm just going, if you don't want to work with me and my job is to write segments for you to put you on TV, then you're not going to get on TV a whole lot because it's a two-way street. And so, just that opening first chapter is just like, more or less is just like extremely interesting, but also it really does set up the rest of the book and just who Brian was, but in relation to all of these megastars.
Yep, and it sets up the world too, because if for whatever reason you've stumbled upon this book and you're not a super fan, you don't read the dirt sheets, you're not privy to the backstage stuff, like you don't know how that world sort of operates. He outlines it really well because he explains like his crimes, as you said, and and beyond like the crime of favoriting certain people, the crime of like not shaking everybody's hand, not making eye contact, not introducing yourself, not just things that are so stupid that wrestlers like get mad about and gossip about and hold grudges, and like he does a great job, I think, of explaining what those sort of are if you're unaware, and sort of making fun of them, but acknowledging that like, well, this is sort of the way it works in this world, so if you want to work here, you have to accept that these are the rules. Like, they may be stupid, they may not make any sense, like you may get ganged up on for no reason for not following them, but nevertheless, like, that's what's going to happen. So like, you either embrace them and understand them and try to be better about it, or you eat shit and lose your job, or have them all just hate you all the time. So I think he does a really good job of showing like you have to adapt, and he admits, to his credit, a lot of the times he didn't follow those rules is because he was nervous and uncomfortable and new, which I can relate to all that stuff. I'm sure I'd be very similar if I worked for WWE, but like, again, it got him out of his shell and he became sort of a stronger person by realizing that he had to just walk around and be confident and own himself and own his position, and good things came when people sort of sensed that emanating off him, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like he talked a little bit about that as a writer for, was it the Jenny McCarthy
show?
Yeah. So where he was a writer and just kind of like sat back and didn't really contribute, and his uncle's like, dude, you gotta like say something, or else you've just taken a spot away from someone else. We could have been writing jokes with us, but like, I guess I use that to illustrate, like, this guy was still young, this guy was still learning the ropes. Like, it took, as a professional working in a professional environment, it took probably both of us many years to get enough reps to feel comfortable going into an office space and like expressing opinions in a tactful way that produces results. Now try doing that when the Undertaker's staring at you and everyone's calling you an idiot, and like, everyone's actively stabbing you in the back in a room full of giant men who hate you. It's like,
and there's a new meaning to tactful too. It's like, be confident but not too confident, like, make your point forcefully but don't be a jerk. Like, it's the rules all of a sudden are so nebulous.
Balancing what I'm going to call Vince McMahon tact is an art that I don't think anyone has ever really mastered.
He might be the best to do it, like, who knows? Like, there's been people that have been around for just as long. Like, obviously there's the Bruce Pritchards of the world, and like, people who are considered yes men, but certainly regardless of whatever their suck-uppitude is, they've worked with Vince for years, so like, they're doing something right, or they were doing something right to stick around in a job for decades. But Brian definitely gives off the vibe of someone who, wanted to be somewhere else probably at the beginning, and then settled in and found his way to communicate with a guy like Vince McMahon. And this is a great Vince McMahon book, Walt. Like, there's so many Vince stories, very little, combativeness. I would say Brian is very good at not breaking up old grudges himself. Again, separating him from the Justin Roberts of the world. Like, there's a couple times you can sense like he has an issue with somebody, but he doesn't really go into it too often. And the Vince stuff in particular, you can tell he had his ups and downs of Vince for sure, but he goes out of his way to praise the positive sides of Vince. The stuff that he saw from his perspective. It's a weird time to be reading a positive sort of Vince McMahon book, but he does go. The way Brian talks about it, I'm like, I can see from this seat, from this perspective, why you felt this way about Vince.
Many wrestlers have creative differences with Vince, and we hear about that in many books. I feel like this is so much more different. Like, it's like this guy's only job and worth is to write and create ideas for a bunch of wrestlers. It's like, he can't just go put on a 5-star match and go, well, I don't know if I think Daniel Bryan or Kofi Kingston or whoever, or Big E or any fan favorite. It's like, they might get in arguments with Vince, but then when they produce in his wrestling ring, it's like, oh, okay, well, I might not agree with you for that reason, but like, you did a good job with the fake fighting, so like, we're back on good graces. It's like, Brian Gewirtz cannot do that. Like, he just has to like take his losses and his lumps and like see an idea like Katie Vick just go completely off the rails, and or there's 100 examples of that in the book. I mean, that's just the one that sticks out in my head. He has to make it up the next day or the next week or that hour or the next segment by fighting the same fight he just lost. And so like it just really creates fun stories and great interactions. It gives new insight into a problem that a lot of performers have in a completely new way. It's like, again, like he's not a performer, he's a creative guy and a writer. And so like, how do you navigate that with words and arguing, which, as we know, does not usually end up well with Vince McMahon.
Yeah, there's a Vince McMahon quote that he uses in this book. Let me pull it up real quick. It's great. I want you to have your own opinion and stick up for your ideas, but just remember, if you take the fight to me, you're going to lose, ... every time. So Vince is very aware of how things go. He is not afraid to spell it out to people. But I think one of the things that Brian outlines in this book that I really enjoyed is when you talk about like Katie Vick and all those stories. Like, I think sometimes there's an inkling among wrestling fans that people are in a room with Vince and they're like pitching the dumbest shit to like appeal to Vince's common denominators or his low, whatever Vince thinks is funny. There's a bunch of guys and I guess women in there sometimes, but mostly guys, telling Vince like, haha, you should do this, and like they're just trying to make pop Vince and make him smile and get their shit on. But it sounds like the way Brian tells it is, maybe that does happen sometimes, but a lot of the time is they're exhausted because they just have to create wrestling stories over and over again every week for 52 weeks for every day, every year. Like, there's no breaks, and so they're just so fucking tired and out of good juice. Sometimes they say the dumbest things, and Vince goes, "I love it," and then all of a sudden they're just on some roller coaster they can't get off because Vince liked the idea and they're trapped, And when I read that, I'm like, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. Like, I can just see they're just throwing darts at the wall constantly, and obviously sometimes Vince leads them down a road, and again, I'm sure a lot of times people are pandering to the boss, but it sounds like just as often as not, these horrible ideas we hear about after the fact are just someone said one word and Vince glommed onto it, and then you just can't get him off of it, and then you're just stuck, And maybe in 3 weeks he goes, "Oh, that was dog shit." But for those 3 weeks, you're just like, "What are we doing now?" And I just think that perspective is a nice little twist on what I think we're used to hearing. It's not yes men sucking up to the boss all the time. It's just words just get you in trouble without you even realizing it.
And it just creates a new dynamic that is, we don't really explore a whole lot. It's like, oh, you work with Vince to create ideas. He takes your idea and turns it into the most weirdest, craziest version of that idea. And now you have to go call Stone Cold Steve Austin and pitch it to him.
Yes, that's right.
and explain to him why it's a good idea, even though it's not a good idea. And the answer is always going to be because Vince wants us to do it. But you can't say that because now it's like that could be used against you. So now you're just in this crazy talent management position. You're effectively a middleman in the worst possible way. And it's just like, God, what a horrible. And then to do that on a weekly basis is probably even more mind-numbing. I mean, his interactions with Stone Cold Steve Austin, I thought, towards the end of the book, I thought were really interesting in a sense of like, what happens when you are coming up with these crazy ideas and you're pitching it to him, and this guy wants nothing to do with you, and then just goes above your head the second you get off the phone with him to refute it's like, that just creates such a not great situation that, the fact that this guy lasted as long as he did, like, and that's just one wrestler. That's just one example of one wrestler.
But you touched on something that's really, I think, if you don't know Brian from, like we said, various appearances, or just like from general knowledge, we hinted at he's a guy who certainly had his guys and he wrote for them and his voice works coming out of their mouths and he focused on them. His main guy was The Rock. He admits as much in the book. Brian currently works for $7 Productions, which is The Rock's production company. So like he has been by The Rock's side for decades now, and will probably always be by The Rock's side. And it's a good side to be by if you want to make some money, because Rock is a moneymaker to say the least. But it ties in directly to what you're talking about, Walt, is Brian had issues with Stone Cold, and they weren't all directly tied to this, but he admits that a lot of it was Brian and The Rock would be cracking up in the back and talking and being pals and coming up with ideas, and Stone Cold would walk by and be like, I hate these goddamn guy. Like, this guy, like I said, he probably didn't even want Brian's input, but he was also like, look at Brian just hanging out with Rock all the time. They're best buds. Like, backstage is lining up against me. Like, wrestlers, even the top guys like Stone Cold get paranoid and weird, and it's such a pecking order, power ranking, strange universe back there. But Brian owns up to that. Like, there was a lot of issues in being a Rock guy, and I really appreciated how much he talked about in this book. Like, but as you sort of described at the top of the show, Walt, that's just smart. Like, if Brian works for Rock, and if Austin doesn't want his help, why would he not? Like, why would he not go work with Rock all the time? Like, they did great stuff. It's just, part of me thinks Vince likes to, he likes that competition, and he thinks it's good, and even though it is toxic and debilitating a lot of the times, like, I think he probably thinks it produces results. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but it seems like the landmines waiting for Brian at every turn were just so ample. It made me exhausted to think about trying to work backstage at WWE.
Yeah, because for every Stone Cold Steve Austin, there's like a dozen hardcore Hollies that also
who aren't even good,
same.
really. Like, there's nothing to write for hardcore Holly, but he still hates you anyway.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, I look at Brian's relationship with The Rock, and I brought this up earlier, and I'm going to bring it up again because, like, to me, this is the thing that I debated. I had a lot of internal debates about. Is like, I'm going to name 4 wrestlers that he was really closely tied to, and you tell me, are they the smartest people, or was there maybe some element of working with Brian Gewirtz that might have helped them? And it's The Rock, Kurt Angle, Christian, Edge. And at that time in the early 2000s, those 4 guys were doing a lot of vignettes, a lot of backstage segments, a lot of promo work, a lot of writing. Why wouldn't you want help? I mean, like, yeah, you could always just say, like, yeah, I'm not going to do that, or, oh, yeah, but I'm going to do it my way. Like, I'm sure those guys also probably felt the same way if Brian was to overstep his role. But ultimately, though, it's like, are these guys really smart for attaching themselves to Brian and recognizing the value? Or was Brian smart to attach himself to them and kind of find a way into these, like, really creative, fun guys and maximize his value within the company? Like, I don't know, but I just named you 4 legends in the business, and maybe it's a coincidence, but I don't think it is.
And I think those 4 guys, I mean, they're probably not the only 4, but they certainly come to mind as 4 of, like, the most regular comedic guys at that time, like the guys best at delivering a joke, the guys good at making, like, faces, sort of taking the piss out of themselves, being silly. Like, they were all so good at that, like, I mean, Austin is funny as hell, but Austin is just Austin. Like, he's not telling jokes per se at all. He's just being himself, and that alone is usually pretty funny, depending on what he's saying or who he's talking to. But, like, Rock and Angle and Edge and Christian in particular, the last 2, they just were like joke tellers. They were rabble rousers and bullshitters, like, it makes perfect sense to me that they would work together. And so I do wonder, which side it was on. And, I think Brian would, he's, as we said, he's a nerd. He's not entirely built for that world, but he defends himself. I think he would probably tell you it's a solid mix of both. Like, I knew, where my bread was buttered. Certainly they were top guys, but I bet he would say, like, they got a lot from me too. Like, I wrote stuff for them that they wouldn't have come up with otherwise, and they wouldn't have gotten to where they might have found a way eventually, but they wouldn't have straight up gotten where they were if I hadn't been there to help them and build their characters along the way.
His story about working with The Rock for those MTV skits, where The Rock just, like, didn't dismiss this guy immediately. Like, and I think that says something about The Rock, honestly, more than Brian at that point, where he was just like, oh, here's a writer. He's going to write some stuff. Like, it's pretty good. Like, I could work with this. The Rock obviously is very talented, as we know in 2022. He's very successful. And so I don't think he did that by being stubborn and closed-minded and not capable of collaborating and working with people. And there's something to be said there. And those guys are really successful. And I don't know, maybe it means something, but Brian Gewirtz certainly has a lot of stories as a result, and he certainly had a very successful career. both at WWE and now working with The Rock. So I'd say it worked out for everybody.
Yeah, I don't think he has a lot of regrets about the path he took, for sure. I will say, well, one thing that I think this is a very good book. I think it's entertaining as hell. I read it in like 3 sittings. Like, I highly recommend it to all wrestling fans. But there was one part that I thought about where I was like, I think maybe it's a little too inside WWE. I think you get tunnel vision when you work there, and I think that's understandable. Like, you don't get breaks. You don't get to take a time. Like, you can get time off every now and then. Usually it sounds like Vince gives you time off if you explicitly ask for it, but otherwise he wants you in that foxhole, as Brian puts it, out there with him, and that's how you earn trusts, and that's how you get stuff done, that's how you get recognized, that's how you build a career. But the one thing, Brian talks a lot about The Rock versus John Cena and the uniqueness of doing a 3-year, 3 straight Mania type angle. And he's not wrong that is wild. Like, everyone praises the Mega Powers exploding, Hogan and Macho Man. That was like a year plus, maybe, like a little before Mania 4 into Mania 5. Like, and that's like one of the best stories of all time. But like, that's one of the ones that we hold up as, legendary long-term planning, and that was a year and change. So the idea of planning out 3 years is very impressive, but I don't know. Like, I couldn't help but think when I read that chapter is, you and I were at one of the WrestleManias where Rock faced Cena. We were at the last one at 29. And big match, made a ton of money. So if you're looking at it from a WWE perspective, no doubt about it, that was, an extreme success. But I don't, and Brian doesn't hold it up as sacrosanct or perfect, but he does talk about it like it is, so huge. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I know he knows Rock really well, and I know that made a lot of money, and it certainly was 2 of the biggest stars of all time, but I don't think that's held up there with Hulk and Macho, with Hulk and Rock, with Austin Rock, with all the other things that I think are genuinely the best feuds of all time, the best angles of all time. Like, I just think, that it seems to me that was one of those examples where I was like, I love these backstage insights. I love getting this perspective from this guy who was embedded for so long with all these guys, but I'm not sure. I think that was one example where I was like, I think maybe he has, it seemed like he was telling us how big and important this was, as opposed to we knowing, like, it felt more important to him and maybe the people inside than it did to us on the outside, who were like, it was big and fun, but then it was sort of over and we all moved on.
See, I disagree a little bit. I do think that the more time passes, the more we do look back on that as pretty damn special. Like,
do you personally look back on that as special?
Well, it's special because John Cena and The Rock are now household names and huge stars in Hollywood. So, like, the fact that these two, one of which had a very successful Hollywood career during all this, were able to put together this storyline for 3 years is extremely ambitious and kind of rare, because given injuries and scheduling conflicts.
Yeah.
And it did do like some of the best pay-per-view numbers ever, or like some of the top grossing amounts. Or there is some metric that I think is used to find those WrestleManias as like the top grossing. But like, I don't know what those numbers are, and inflation from 1988 and 89, like I'm not sure what the real answer is, but I do think that it probably is the most memorable storyline that he was a part of, because it spanned 3 years. And when The Rock came back that first year, it was huge.
That was huge. I agree with. I mean, like, maybe it's a perspective thing on my end, but I do remember the excitement I felt when Rock came back that first time. Like, I remember being at 30th Street Station in Philadelphia and being on Twitter, and no one knew what was happening, as Brian outlines really well in the book. And then Rock's just back, and you just didn't. It was a time like now he comes back every year and change, and you go, oh, Rock's back. Like, great, good for him. But back then, it truly was remarkable to see him in the ring. It just seemed like he was possibly never going to return, because why would he? He was making all these movies. So the beginning of that was incredibly cool. And the unprecedentedness of it is unique and stands out. I get that, but I don't know. I just don't. It felt to me just like a little bit of like nudge. Like it was the most. I'm sure it was the biggest and most expensive and elaborate long-term plan he worked on. But I don't know. It felt to me a little bit like. I don't know. It doesn't stick out to me. It really doesn't. Like, I don't look back in the annals of WrestleMania and think about, oh man, Rock versus Cena. Like, if maybe it just feels more like of a angle than it does like a long, like, the matches themselves don't stand out. Like, there's not a ton of like high points to it. It just feels like it was a gelatinous 3-year blob, and like I can't pull a lot of high points out of it that really stick with me. I just remember that it happened and took a long time, and then it was over.
mean, look, I mean, we can debate the merits of the match because look, I mean, like, was the wrestling the best 5-star matches ever? Like, no, and I don't think anyone would say that it is. I also think that wasn't necessarily the point of him bringing that up, was to kind of like glorify this moment in wrestling history, because again, that's debatable. You know, given and noting the time of recording and the date of recording is a couple of days after another organization in wrestling had a giant blow up with their stars over.
Good on you for not naming any names.
Well, yeah, it'll get brought up in the lawsuit, I'm sure. But wow, how relevant is hearing about stories of The Rock and John Cena trying to work together and almost coming to blows and just huge misunderstandings with regards to taking liberties and shots, and two guys who at the time did not like each other putting aside their differences to work together, and what a rocky road it was leading up to them actually getting in the ring and actually having to work together as wrestlers. And pretty relevant today. Will continue to be relevant in wrestling, but like that was really the biggest takeaways for me. Was like every week there was like a new slight that both of these mega stars, had they been two different stars, could have combusted in this whole huge money making angle that spanned over 3 WrestleManias, could have just went away due to ego. And so learning about that and hearing those because like there's a lot of those promos that I like barely remembered or didn't remember very well. And so going kind of like week by week and promo by promo, that him listing all of these misunderstandings that led to conflict and how they kind of got past it, and how honestly how Bryan got past it, because to your point, him being a Rock guy did not really sit well with Cena at times, it would seem, during all this. So like, yeah, I found that stuff really fascinating from a just like two megastars working together despite really not liking each other.
Yep, you're extremely right about that, and it really does take on more resonance now, because you think about, as you said, the series of wrestlers who are currently feuding in a weird blood feud over perceived slights are big, certainly one super outsized personality who seems prickly and annoying to say the least, but they're not John Cena, they're not The Rock, like it's almost quaint to see the guys who are feuding right now and be like, oh, that's adorable, Tony Khan, you have to deal with Matt and Nick Jackson, friends of the show, love Matt and Nick Jackson to death, but like they're not billion-dollar making movie stars, TV stars, household names. Like that is a personality to deal with, like that is, and one to WWE's credit, they manage those people really well. Like, though there are these blow-ups, like you said, and there are these complications and the tension, you might be able to cut it with a knife sometime. You don't hear a ton of stories about people coming to blows in the backstage of WWE over stuff like this. You certainly, about Vince and Brett and Shawn from 20 years ago, but you don't hear that about, most of the time in WWE, people settle down, they focus, they do the job, they know the money's on the line, they know that they gotta be, eventually you gotta put your bullshit aside and get the work done, even if you hate the other person, you almost always do that. So it is particularly notable these days to see like what is causing an issue on the other side and realizing, wow, Bryan had to deal with like 10 times more money, more tension, and more bullshit than is currently happening in the world today.
Yeah, but think if there was a producer or writer, like I guess maybe Ace Steel, I don't know,
yeah.
who you point to and say, like, if something didn't work out, it's like, you're at fault for this too, over conflicts, like locker room conflicts. Like, it seemed pretty high stakes for Bryan too, because he was still very much in WWE at the time, and he was the only person assigned to this storyline. I mean, outside of Vince, but like, he was there working with the talent, and so like any perceived slights would have potentially ruined his career at WWE or at Seven Buck Productions. Like, if that ended up not materializing, those matches, and it blows up before it ever gets there, like, there might be a lot of finger pointing at the guy writing the promos or helping write the promos that led to that conflict. So like in the case of the Rock and John Cena, I think it is important to know that the guy telling the story also had a lot to do with potential conflict. And so navigating that and the stakes attached to that become pretty important. So ultimately it was just like, I thought a great revisit of a pretty what I believe will be conceived as an iconic feud, and just like how it all came to be, and how they ended up making a lot of money too.
Yeah, they made a ton of money, and it definitely is one of those things. I will say, in retrospect, it looks clean and easy and straightforward, like Rock Cena plug and play. But for The Rock didn't have to do that. Like The Rock had no reason to come back beyond he likes wrestling, he likes WWE, he wanted to work with Cena. Like Rock was taking, and I don't want to say I don't want to make it sound too dramatic, but like it was a risk in that if he got hurt, which he eventually did, or if he looked like a fool, or if, like you said, if things went belly up, if for some reason it didn't connect with fans, which is always, even big stars come out all the time and they get usually a welcome back pop, and then it's like, okay, what do you got for me right now? What are you gonna do today? Like, so there was a chance that Rock could come back and it would have just been totally shat on, and now he's sort of stuck in this angle, and at least until the next Mania is over, like it didn't have to do that. So I think it's a good recap of like to your point, Brian, juggling all these sticks of dynamite and just trying to keep everybody happy. And it sounds like Vince trusted him to the point where he was like, you're in charge of this, like everything on Raw is you, so Raw better go well or else I'm coming back and I'm yelling at you. So it is high pressure, it is high stakes, and I certainly am happy Brian put it in the book, because it does really show like the level of trust he has, and also like it's getting to the end of the book, so it shows like this is just getting to be too much. This is exhausting. Maybe I'm just it's a young man's game, and I do a great job and I'm trusted to death, but perhaps I can't do this the rest of my life. And he didn't, and he got a nice job out of it. He got Young Rock out of it. So, and he wrote an episode of previously covered on the show Young Rock. So it worked out pretty well for Brian, as you said, which is great.
And many more endeavors that are
The Rock is endlessly busy and has a billion projects, and it's great. And but just getting this book is like to loop back to the beginning. It's just there's no hot goss, there's no burying of anybody. I really appreciated that. It could have easily been those things. Like, he's so out of wrestling, if he wanted to say more, like he makes one comment about how Bubba Ray Dudley was a dick. If he wanted to bury Bubba Ray Dudley, why would he not? Like, that, he's welcome to do that. Like, he wouldn't be the first, and he's going to suffer no repercussions for it. But he doesn't waste time in doing that. Like, even the Paul Heyman story, which is one of the great stories in the book, like, he tells the whole story of their conflict. He doesn't rag on Heyman for just, like, he tells truthful stories from his perspective on why Heyman is a weirdo and difficult to work with and complicated and unique, but he doesn't make you think Paul Heyman sucks and I dislike him. He's just, Paul Heyman's great at his job. He's just nuts, and we had a bunch of fights, and then we got over it. Like, it's just, I really appreciate that he comes at it with a fresh, like, he's not burnt out, he's not bitter, he's got none of that. He's just like, it was what it was amazing, and here are some stories from this remarkable time in my life.
Well, I mean, like we've noted before, Brian is not a wrestler, so he does possess a level of sensibility. No, but I mean that is to say, like, he's very, like, fair in his assessment. He's like, listen, I could have done this. And he's very self-aware in many of his interactions that go south. Like, look, I would present ideas to Stone Cold. He would go over my head. He didn't really respect me. But also he was burned out, and every week was an exercise in trying to figure out how he's going to raise hell. And it's like, it was exhausting for him. It was exhausting for us. And it just created like animosity. But, like, I get it. And so just hearing him talk about those moments and with, like, a very balanced fairness of, look, I'm not perfect, and this is how I could have approached it differently too. It just made following his journey a lot more palatable than a performer who's, like, just bitter and like, to your point, trying to bury people. It's like, all right, cool, you got your shit in, but, like, I don't get a sense that you really gave me the story, like the actual story. You gave me your story. And so, I think that level-settedness only enhances his narrative and his stories, which were really great.
Absolutely, and it's time too. Like, he took just enough time away, I think, to have some distance from these things and to tell them with, like you said, self-awareness, self-deprecation, like, able to be funny, like, Justin Roberts, to call back to the book of a guy who didn't take the time and pause and then come back at it with a straight head. He just wanted to tell the stories of the people who were mean to him. And yeah, I'm sure they're all jerks. Like if I worked at WWE, they would pants me and give me wedgies and throw food. Like they would treat me like such shit. They would sense the weakness right away and they would pounce. Even the nice guys these days would probably still make fun of me all the time. But I like to think that even if it was the case, I like to think maybe I'd grow a spine and maybe when I looked back, I would recognize that I had my own personal failings, as Brian does, that led to that happening, and not write the pissiest book of all time about how guys were mean to me. So I love that. Like I just think it's the perfect time, perfect place. He's the epitome of a right time, right place guy across the board. Like that young, got in at the right time, like you said, a magical era to work in, and stuck with it, and emerged with a bunch of great stories. And like it's just a fun read. Like it's it's just not too dour, it's not too depressing, and he doesn't puff himself up too much. Like he does when probably he needs to, but mostly he just tells the stories, and a bunch of great Michael Hayes stories we didn't even talk about. Like it's a refreshing, delightful wrestling read when many of even the good books that we praise to death are sometimes not always refreshing and delightful.
It's a little less linear than most of these biographies and autobiographies and books, in a sense that he kind of just tells good stories and they happen to kind of go in some weird chronological order, but not really. Very so it trends closer to Moxley-esque than typical wrestling book fodder, but which I like. I like that he's like, great, here's a fun story, and then it leads to another story. And it's not like I did this, then this, then this.
He gets his shit out of the way real quick too, which I appreciated. He doesn't spend a lot of time talking about Syracuse. It's like we didn't buy this book to read about Syracuse.
Right. Some of the memory lane stuff, like the celebrity host era of Raw.
Oh, because you were watching that. I wasn't watching the celebrity host era. It sounds terrible.
Just A++. Just, not just because of like how it was written around. Just the fact that like we're talking about this. We haven't really talked a whole lot about this in previous iterations and books and documentaries, but we should, because it's like insane that this was a thing for.
We should do an episode where we literally go back and watch a bunch of the celebrity guest host segments and talk about them in detail. Yes.
I'd love that.
It's its own. They sound. I did not realize. Like I knew there was. I guess I knew guest hosts were like literally guests. I didn't realize that every week they were trying to have somebody. That's just. How are they expecting to keep up that pace? That's a horrible idea.
That is a booking nightmare.
It's so bad. You book talent. Like that's. Can you imagine? Especially for a show like that. Like but like I get if you were just like able to take on any B-C list guy or girl that came across, but like for Raw, like I'm sure Vince wanted like people he's heard of too.
Yeah, and I mean like just take what is like the hardest task in media of writing this 3-hour show weekly, and then adding a celebrity guest. Who knows how that comes together and all the ups and downs of that process. Like, way to just throw a grenade in the middle of an assembly line that is already chaos. Like, I don't know. So A++ reading all those again.
We're gonna, now that we've gone that, we didn't go into enough here. We're gonna talk more about that, because I want to get we're gonna talk off mic, and because like that's where you got me back watching again. I think at the tail end of that era, right?
I believe so. I mean, I couldn't even put years to it.
I know. I laugh all the time watching a clip of Rob Zombie saying "The Miz," and he just goes, "The Miz, come on!" And so that alone I enjoy, and that was probably one of the good moments is Rob Zombie. So we need to revisit Piven, and Hugh Jackman, I believe, was the guest host of Raw. Is that correct?
Yeah,
that's insane. He's like A++ level star. Why would he do that?
He's promoting some shit.
All right, well, we're going to come back to that. But as you said, I love a good conversation about something that isn't talked about a ton, and Brian dipped into a bunch of that as well. So the book is called There's Just One Problem by Brian Gewirtz. It's great. It's available everywhere books are sold, Amazon and elsewhere, and it's just a great read. So definitely go pick that up if you're a wrestling fan, if you're curious. And maybe there'll be more conversation about this someday. Well, maybe not next episode, but we're hoping to have maybe a special guest down the line who may or may not be talking more about this book with us.
I like that we don't name names, so that
Well, that's our thing today. Is we don't want to put a name on anything. We'll just plus then if it doesn't happen, we can present. What are you talking about? That wasn't going to happen. So don't even worry. But if it does, it'll be fun. So
except that we started using names. And
yeah, well, we can't resist. That's good timing because we're literally the wrestling is about to begin to date this episode a little bit. So by the time you listen to this episode, some of the things we said may already been replaced by new things that are newly insane. So that's its own thing. But for now, Brian Gewirtz's book is out, and we heartily recommend it. It's a treat. I think, Walt, you would agree it's a treat?
Sweet treat.
A sweet treat. So go check that out. And if you want more Awesome Truth, you can find our archives at awesometruth.libsyn.com. Subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher, everywhere podcasts are delivered. And review us, especially on Spotify. I know they have a review option now, a ranking system. Please do that. We would love that. Get us more and more Spotify views. And, of course, on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else as well. Anything you can do to puff us up is appreciated. And you can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at AwesomeTruthPod. Walt, great to talk Gewirtz with you. Delightful. And let's go watch some wrestling and see what else is going on in this crazy world that we love reading about and talking about.
Yes, let's watch the wrestling now.
We will go watch the wrestling. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, the truth will set you free.